Welcome to the Sourcing Exchange, where we connect, share, and discuss insights that shape the future of sourcing in the apparel industry.
Welcome, Ahmed. It's so wonderful to have you on the Sourcing Exchange. We're very grateful for your time, and you really have a wonderful background covering academia, industry, multiple startups, plus more, as we're learning more recently. Look, I really love these sourcing discussions, particularly in the fashion industry. They're super fruitful and super contemporary when you think about world politics today and many other things about business in general. So thank you for joining us. We're really grateful for that. Maybe we kick off with a little bit of learning around your background. That would be wonderful.
Yeah, sure. So my background is sort of a blend. I'm formally trained as an academic. So I was based here in the UK at the University of Cambridge, where I did my PhD, my postdoc. I was a lecturer there. The real story starts back in 2008 because my family are third generation apparel manufacturers. And in 2008, when the financial crisis happened, a lot of our customers defaulted on their payments. Many of them don't exist today. And so we owed a lot of money to our suppliers. And limited liability isn't really a thing where I'm originally from, which is Pakistan. So we had to address that problem in a slightly different way. So when the crisis happened, we owed a lot of money to our suppliers. The suppliers essentially said, we're just going to take someone in your family, and when you pay us back, we'll give that person back. And so I had a really hands-on experience with the challenges of this industry and the business model that drives this industry, which is around this cognitive dissonance that I had as a child, and I was a child when this happened, which is, as I got older, one, I decided that I didn't ever want to do anything with the fashion industry. After that one experience where, admittedly, I was more involved in having to solve that experience. My father is a professional, he's a doctor, and he didn't necessarily feel that he had the necessary skill set to negotiate a release of a family member and some sort of payment structure. So he looked at his 16-year-old son and said, you're going to do it. So I had to travel. My family originally from Lahore, so I had to travel and meet these individuals. And what I realized during that time was that this whole business model that actually starts in the late 1800s with the standardization of sizing and this obsession with inventory creation. I'm going slightly here on a tangent, but that is once I understood the history, this entire business from 1800s, late 1800s, where sizing was standardized, where inventory bets were made. Just here in England, in east of London, if you look at the history, you'll see a lot of labor riots, a lot of worker riots during that time. The reason why there were riots was because as inventory was created, you're making a bet on what inventory is going to sell and what's not. And obviously, you're going to get that bet wrong. So take that to its latest extent now, where we live in a world where things are inherently unpredictable. The mechanisms of solving that risk, which I'm sure we'll get to, become even more dire. And so my life lived experience was one where I was witnessing the side effects of this business model. In the moment, as a child, a 16-year-old teenager, I just decided I never wanted to do anything with the fashion industry ever again. But life has a weird way of pulling you back to your roots. Because when I was an academic, I had just finished my PhD. I got involved on a UN white paper focused on how can we develop a new business model for the fashion industry that considers the externalities of the macroeconomics of the world, consumer behavior, technology, sustainability, and policy. And so whilst I was working on that, I realized that there was some opportunity here to, use my experience, use my background and my understanding of the industry to drive the industry towards something more sustainable. And I don't mean that in just an environmental sense. I mean that in a financial sense. I mean that in a sense of dignity. How do we build a real partnership between the brands and the suppliers, which it seems, and I don't think anyone would dispute this statement, which is it's a somewhat of an antagonistic relationship, an adversarial one even. So how do we change that? How do we develop incentives in the system that allow both parties to thrive?
Amazing, amazing backdrop. Can I delve into one question? Because it sounds like through your younger years, it kind of percolated into your later life into a purpose, right? A purpose which, if I understand correctly, you want to set out and try and make this industry more respected, more fair, more equitable, and more progressive, right, is the purpose. And then you lean into, then as a consequence, though, you're acknowledging that there's some
Adversarial relationships.
Adversarial relationships within there, right? I think a question within that is, where can you set your sights that's achievable? Because I don't think in my point of view anyway, it's unlikely there's a future where all suppliers and all retailers and the whole value chain are best friends and joined at the hip, right? Or maybe I'm not hopeful enough, right? But I think part of the answer of making everybody more happy to work together is having a reasonable expectation around what's possible, because it can't all be good all the time, right?
Right.
So I don't even know if that's if that falls into the discussion around where we set our sights and making it something that we believe in as realistic.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where if you want to get from point A to point B, you need to understand what point A is.
Yeah.
Right. And I think what's currently an issue in the industry is that the two parties don't fully understand one another. What do I mean by that? The brands or the people buying always have a sense that the manufacturers have more margin than they're giving, that they're not necessarily, giving us all the pieces of information that are necessary for us to make an important decision. But the buyers are well-intentioned. Equally, on the supplier side, there's always a sense that the buyer just cares about cost. And actually, they're not well-intentioned. They're trying to squeeze us for every margin that we have. And so as a result, we're never going to tell them our real capacity because they're going to just use that for commercial gain, which might be the case. But I don't think that's necessarily the case. It's not that either side is not well-intentioned. Is that they just don't understand each other's incentives.
Kind of hedging a little bit.
Correct.
Yeah.
And so the first thing is, why is that the case, right? And it goes back to the history that I was trying to explain, which is it wasn't industrial revolution and mechanization that resulted in mass production. It was sizing. They created standardized sizes and they were able to bucket inventory, but that meant they had risk. When you create risk, you have a mechanism to address that risk. What's that mechanism? Discounts. You create artificial demand and you get your product out. But in order for you to be able to have that discount, you need to build in margin at the point that you buy the product, the incoming margin. So that becomes your negotiation tactic with the suppliers. Now, in order to achieve, the bigger the risk, the bigger margin you need for discounts. So you got to squeeze something. What do you squeeze? You squeeze the cost. That's why the riots happened in east of London. But then we had this great thing called globalization. Globalization meant we didn't have to have the problem in our backyard. We could export it to someone else's backyard. And that's what happened. You see, Nike was a pioneer of this, what I call financial arbitrage, buying from Japan, importing into the US, and making an enormous margin. This worked incredibly well. And, the whole fashion industry we see today is built on globalization. But then you reach a point where the demand volatility, the forecast volatility, the ability to manage risk with just reducing cost becomes so difficult that even at the point of, let's say manufacturing in Bangladesh or Cambodia, where you have rock bottom prices, even at that point, you're still unable to mitigate the risk because there's not enough, just discounting alone isn't getting the product out. And not only that, you've got higher MOQs. You've got interest on your inventory. You've got complex logistics costs to take care of. Now you have tariffs. So you add all that up and you're basically creating a system that is going to collapse. For many people, has already collapsed. And so that's the systemic issue that I'm trying to put into question. Is this the only way to reduce risk? So my work as a mathematician was focused around how can you predict the future? I came to a simple answer. You can't. You cannot predict the future. No forecasting, whether with AI or on a napkin, is going to tell you what's going to happen 18 months from now. So what's your alternative? And that's the answer that I'm trying to get to.
Yes.
That's my whole purpose. It's the alternative.
Yes.
And I don't think there are many people talking about the alternative. People are talking about AI is going to help us predict the future better. We're going to have better forecasting. No,
Yes.
that is not going to happen. I can tell you, I have a PhD in this. That is not the future. The future is how do you build, and we'll get to that, which is anti-fragility.
Yes.
How do you build a system that thrives in uncertainty? Because that's the world we live in.
Let's get to anti-fragility in soon. Maybe can you just paint a picture that you'll surprise a lot of people by saying the ability to forecast, particularly with new tooling, is not the answer, right? There'll be a lot of people going, yeah, I think it is the answer.
Right.
Maybe, I don't know, is there a story you can share, something that helps?
Sure. Okay. Let's take the recent model that Google DeepMind released around weather.
Mm-hmm.
Weather is a science that we've understood incredibly well, right? We understand the physics of weather, the rules of weather. Mm-hmm. And this model that was plastered on the front page of Nature, which is like, one of the best scientific publications, said that Google DeepMind built a model using all of this horsepower and all of the minds that they have that can predict 15 days from today accurately. Just 15 days.
Yes.
We understand the science. We have incredible amounts of data, historical analysis to the minute.
Yes.
All the great minds and all this horsepower in terms of GPUs and training compute power. And they're bragging about the fact that they can predict 15 days from now. Now, the fashion industry, in contrast, is saying, yeah, we're going to build a model in my bedroom.
Yes.
Or even, let's say, $100 million business, which is honestly a fraction of what Google spends on their weather models.
Yes.
That's going to predict 18 months from now what people are going to buy. Not only that, we don't understand the science of human behavior.
Yes.
We don't understand the science of human cycle. I don't know if I'm going to buy something until I walk into a store, hold it, test it, feel it, wear it. There's no physics to that. There are no axioms that we rely upon on consumer purchase.
Yes.
So how do you expect to build a model that somehow is able to do that on a science that's not well established, human cognition, human behavior, over a timeline of 18 months, or even 12 months, or even 9 months?
Mm-hmm. Can I throw a question and an observation you can pick up on, whichever one you like? On the time horizon, like the 12 to 18 months, I think everyone engages with that, right? It's just too long. And then to use Shein as an example, only because it's kind of the other end of the spectrum, they're nearly a make-to-order business, right? Because they've compressed the lead time so much. Perhaps they're kind of leaning into what you're saying, right? Which is the ability to predict beyond a week or 2 weeks is getting difficult, right? So they've compressed things so much. I'm not too sure if that's part of the solution. I suspect compression of lead time is part of the solution. But the other observation I wanted to make was when we talk about fashion, we always talk about basics, seasonal, and fashion. I think people suspect you can predict basics. You can predict basics more accurately than the other categories. But I guess even that has a limit, right? As to, particularly within our industry, where even basics has typically a 3-month lead time at a minimum, right? Particularly where you're importing. Do either of those things, do you adjust any of your statement based on either of those things?
Sure. I mean, so I think it's definite that different products have different volatility. And naturally, that determines their predictability. So if you're talking about like a plain white T-shirt, sure, the uncertainty around a plain white T-shirt is going to be much lower than the uncertainty around, a niche polka dot print. Definitely, there's definitely that variance. So that definitely plays a role. But the thing, I'm not saying that you shouldn't forecast. You absolutely need to forecast. It's just, what is the role that your forecast plays in your overall decision making is what I'm questioning.
Yeah.
There's a statement by a mutual friend of ours, Brad Ballantyne, who says, I'd rather be approximately right than precisely wrong.
Yeah.
And so I'm arguing that how do we build a system that understands that forecasts are meant to be just approximately right, whereas we treat forecasts in an MRP model as a precision decision that drives all the downstream decisions, or upstream rather.
Yeah. I guess that leads to potentially, do you want to lean into a little bit your point of view on what we can be thinking, this new decision framework that we can start thinking about as a solution to the problem? I think you refer to it as an anti-fragility concept, right? Something that we should perhaps make more common vernacular, potentially starting from this discussion here. Do you want to jump into that a little bit?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, I think the philosopher, Nassim Taleb, mathematician as well, trader, made a lot of money in the, subprime mortgage collapse that happened in 2008. And his secret was, what if we're wrong? How do we build a system that even if we're wrong, we make money? That was his objective.
Yeah.
And he came up with this idea of anti-fragility. The issue with the supply chain today is that it's the opposite of anti-fragility. It's fragile. It's heavily based on forecast, assumption that we're correct, all the way throughout the entire supply chain. What anti-fragility is this adoption of, in a way, the closest word that I can think of that people would understand is agility. What does that mean? That means, how do you create operations that give you the ability to thrive in uncertainty, which is one example, one mechanism of that, and this is just one, there's many, is postponement.
Yep.
Right? So you buy yarn, and then and you have to plan yarn, and then at that point, at some stage, you convert it to fabric, and then some stage you dye it, and then at some stage you cut it, and so on and so forth. And at each of those stages, you're getting closer to the start of your season, and the uncertainty around your forecast decreases. That sounds great. But the reality is, how do you orchestrate that? How do you execute it? And that's the other components around, how do you make this vision a reality? I can dive into that if you like.
Yeah, I mean, there's two ways I think we should dive into it, right? Like, it'd be wonderful to get into the depth of this topic. I think there's a question as to, because this idea of postponement, what I've learned about the industry is when you ask retailers and brands, are you postponing or are you pre-positioning? They always say yes, right? But then when you provide a subsequent question, which is, are you doing it in a scalable fashion? Right? The answer is always no. So no, we're doing it with a couple of fabrics. We're doing it with one or two suppliers. So this is where your point around orchestration, right? How can you orchestrate it in a scalable fashion? But one question before we delve in then is, why do you think companies they're familiar with the concept, why aren't we seeing more scalable solutions in this area?
A lot of that comes down to process. And I think that process was devised for two reasons. One, there was a different approach to buying. It was, as I said, the old arbitrage, where you would buy cheap and, sell high and you have your margin to discount. That's one reason. The second reason is that the tools that are used to make these decisions, which is primarily spreadsheets, which I have nothing against spreadsheets. I think spreadsheets are fantastic, where you're making low dimensional decisions. Now, I can dive into what that means, but if you're making low dimensionality decisions, spreadsheets are the best tool. But as you get into higher and higher dimensions, decision making, spreadsheets fail to serve the purpose. Postponement is inherently a high dimensional decision-making process, right? So if you start from the beginning, the first thing is, what is my risk across all these different SKUs? Risk isn't only across SKUs, it's across sizes, it's across markets, right? So if you're aggregating demand from different markets have different inherent variance, depending on the size of the market or how big or small your exposure is in that particular market. So you have all these different attributes that you need to model. Once you know whether this is a low, medium, high risk, just for simplicity, you need to understand, based on this low, medium, high risk, how does this translate to a material preposition? And what are those individual timelines? Now, you're not working with one supplier, you're working with several suppliers. Each of those suppliers have different lead times. Maybe they're a vertical supplier, maybe they're a tier 1 supplier, and you need to have a transit lead time from their tier 2 to tier 1. All these complex, maybe they have different MOQs. Now, you can see how the dimensionality of those decisions are increasing. You have to manage MOQs, lead times, transit times, costs, different, each SKU has slightly different, variance and volatility, and that needs to play into account your decision-making on when do you convert it from yarn to fabric, when do you dye it. Not only that, you might be deal sourcing a style. So you might have multiple suppliers making the same style. So how do you then account for that? And so you can see how spreadsheets soon fall short of being able to make these high dimensionality decisions. And I think the power of AI, which I think everyone is ignoring, is everyone is obsessed with predictive technology. I'm obsessed with optimization. I'm obsessed with finding the optimal route given here's the finite information I have. And that's really where I think the real opportunity is, because you can actually prove it. And secondly, I think the real limitation in predictive models, you have discretion. What I mean by that is, let's say, for example, I build you a very complex AI model, and I say, this is going to predict your skew forecast with 98% accuracy. Okay, what does accuracy even mean? We can have a separate discussion about that. You might have a intuition-based model, which has some data. Oh, I look at historical sales. I look at the weather. I look at my experience and tribal knowledge, and I come up with a prediction. And there's no way of knowing which of those predictions is better, because it's a counterfactual. It's in the future. And so that becomes a very contentious issue. Whereas with optimization, there is a very clear way of knowing which one is the better route to take. Because you've compared against all other possible routes. And those routes are known because you're playing within a system. So anyway, what I'm trying to say is the multi-dimension decision-making opens us up to a whole new world of how we do things on the sourcing and supply chain side, which I think has enormous benefits.
And when you say there's a whole new world of the way we can do things, is it centered largely around the postponement and pre-positioning, enabling that and making it a more manageable way for a buyer or a sourcing executive to work with it? Or are you broadening the scope even further? Because, I mean, naturally that leads into critical path management.
Much beyond that. Much beyond that. I mean, I think it's an end-to-end change, right? What is the role of designer today? The role of designer today is to, maybe do some inspirational shopping, identify some trends, come up with a theme, and build a collection. At no point in that decision are there any considerations about what are the upstream impacts of this design decision. In the middle of the season, or like from one season to another, a designer will be like, you know what, I really don't like that fabric. I'm going to swap it to this other fabric. A sourcing person will know what a headache that is. Because they don't understand the complexity of that single decision. Just a color change means a different lab dip approval. Not to even mention the complexity in the factory to make sure that lab dip matches R&D versus production, right? Loads of different intricate things. It has an entire butterfly effect. One change on design. Today, that's hidden. The benefit of multidimensional decision-making is that you can pull forward all those future externalities, which is, what is the lead time impact of my design decision? What is the cost impact? What is the CO2 impact? What is my holistic cost of ownership impact? What does that mean? Well, if I take all those things combined, where I know my lead time's longer, where I know my cost is maybe lower, let's say, that window, that whole, am I going to be able to rebuy into it if I'm short? Am I going to be able to change my colorways if it's needed later into the season? What do those risk factors, and what are the role that those risk factors play in my net profitability? One of the biggest challenges is that everyone making a decision in the supply chain is completely disconnected from net profitability, from what's the overall cost of ownership versus what's my incoming margin. So that's one example. Design, I think we talked a little bit about sourcing, merchandising as well, where you're talking about, I'd like to forecast this many units, or I've picked up on this replenishment signal and I need to buy into this. Well, is that replenishment signal worth taking? Do we know how long it's going to take? What's the decision parameters that you need to make there? Again, that's a lot of things to consider, all the way down to the factory floor. I'm talking about planning individual machines. There's a lot of complexity that goes into figuring out which fabric goes into which machine, how long do you run it for, what happens if you have to do a reprocessing. Dye reprocessing is a big issue. It's one of the major reasons for delays. So there's all these components that are detached from one another, but there is a possibility of connecting them. And the vision that I have for the future is that brands should be able to place orders directly with factories digitally and simulate scenarios instantly and have confirmations on their lead times instantly. Once you make the cost of information zero, it opens up a whole new world. What do I mean by cost of information? Today, if I need to make a new order, what happens? I send an email to my supplier. They have a merchandiser who's speaking to me. They're a salesperson, the account manager. That individual will say, all right, you want 1,000 pieces of this SKU? Let me go speak to the relevant people in my team. Give me a couple of days, and I'll find out if we can do it. Mm-hmm. Then they'll come back to you and say, yes, no, maybe, here's another scenario. That's one question. What if I want to simulate 100 different possible scenarios? Okay, what if I buy 850 instead of 1,000 units? What if I buy in these colorways instead of this colorways? What if I need to send it to these destinations instead of these destinations? What is the overall best decision that I should make given the constraints of my supply chain and the understanding I have of my demand? Mm. That's not a possibility today because the cost of information is too high. The information lead time is too high. When you have this approach, your information lead time goes down to zero, and it changes the entire approach of how you manage your business. Suddenly, people who are managing supply planning, doing sourcing, are actually working strategically as opposed to operationally. Today, what is the role of the supply planning team? Trying to do capacity planning, whatever that is, right? Trying to ensure that when things get pulled forward, the material's still available. Doing these firefighting decisions 24/7, as opposed to being able to think more holistically and strategically about what can I do to drive the business forward. And so it has all these secondary and second order effects that improve the business, but the first order effects are enormous. Mm-hmm. And I think very difficult to measure even. I think any estimate that I'd give would be an underestimation of the impact that you can have if you have zero information lead time. But that requires you to be able to go all the way down to the machine level at a mill or at a spinning mill, doing yarn, so that you can understand the exact permutations of your decisions. And the thing is, it's a reality that we can see today. The tools are there, like the technology is necessary. The tools are not there; we're developing them, but the technology is there. Is the mindset there? It's there in pieces, but I think once the initial early adopters do take on this approach, the rest will most definitely follow.
I think this is the key question that you're touching on right here at the end around the technology. Sourcing has kind of been the forgotten cousin for a long time, and all the money for technology development or service provision has normally gone consumer facing.
Yeah.
I think since the pandemic, I think we're in this period. It's a good time to be in sourcing, actually. We're in a period of catch up. The profile's lifted, but certainly coming from a long way back when it comes to tools available on the market, right? But technology itself is just changing radically right in front of us at the moment. How hard or how long do you think it would take to develop the vision that you're painting? How far away do you think it is, or do you see a roadmap to the end state? What can you tell us about the journey to come?
I see a roadmap to the end state. Mm-hmm. We're already deploying planning tools in factories today, which are doing machine level planning. So today, like, how does a factory plan? When you initially give them an order to do what's called a macro plan. Like, okay, we'll roughly expect in July, you're going to give us this many units, we'll block some capacity out. They won't do the machine level plan. Mm-hmm. Once July comes around, they'll do machine level plans for every 2 to 4 weeks, primarily because it's so complex. You got to think about every permutation, which machine can handle which gauge and diameter, what's the yarn tension, all that kind of stuff. And so you're setting up these machines only 2 weeks in advance, but then what usually ends up happening is that maybe orders drop, maybe orders go up and down. And so your orders get pulled forward or get pushed out. Maybe they prioritize one brand over another. And all that's happening sort of invisibly. So with technology, you can plan down to the machine level instantly every single time. So you know exactly when your order is going to when your yarn is going to be spun, when that yarn is going to convert into fabric. You'll know exactly when that happens. And if it does change, you'll know. So one, it takes, and then I'll add one more element to that. If a brand comes into a factory and says, hey, we need you to swap this fabric with this fabric, that now, or this SKU with this SKU. Let's say you're, circular knitting a garment, a sweater. Okay, you're gonna have a circular knitting machine. You're gonna have a linking piece, and you're gonna have a finishing piece. Just that one change in a factory, in some of the best factories, takes a week. because you have to go and replan everything. You can't just pull it out. You got to fill it in with something. And if you're going to pull it earlier, you got to move something back or forward. And then you got to tell the linking people to do the same thing, and they got to figure out if it works. Then you got to tell the finishing people to do the same thing, and they got to figure out if it works. So, and then you got to piece it all together. That decision, that's a multi-dimension decision making, which is extremely expensive today. It takes a week to do. That goes from a week to a second.
Hey, I share the vision, and our company shares a very similar vision. One of the sticking points that we constantly talk about is access to the data, or how long it takes. How long will it take to get sufficient data? I think seeing how it all connects, much like you, I feel like I can see the roadmap and the end state to a degree. What's your point of view on data and getting the data to support it?
What do you need data for?
So we're kind of deep into the topic of costing and trying to link costing to carbon. Getting reliable sources of costing information, which is typically at the garment level, at the fabric level, but never broken down beyond that. I shouldn't say never, commonly not. And you know the dilemmas in getting meaningful carbon data. We're reliant on finding that data and building that data, because we can envision once we have that data, naturally we have a clearer understanding around many things, right? I don't know if that helps answer.
No, it helps. It helps. Yeah. I think you need data for predictive tasks.
Yeah.
Where you're trying to build, a missing link between, in your case, garment and carbon. But when you're talking about planning, that's an optimization problem. You just need to know the constraints, and then the solver will do the rest. So you almost don't need historical data. You need data because that's what the model works. But you need live data, current data. And there's a challenge there, right? How do you get that information? So, but that information already exists in this case because they're planning anyway. And the solver is just simplifying it for them. So that's why I love optimization, because you don't need historical data. You could use historical data for highly complex optimization tasks where there is a variance and you want to look at what the historical variance could be. And then, you want to do something, quite intelligent around. I'll give you a small example. So, so when you're making fabric, you're trying to hit a certain GSM. Let's say it's 150 GSM. But if you're going to dye it with a dark color, it's going to add GSM. And if it's a light color, it adds less GSM. So if you want to minimize your rejection chance on a commercial sense, and that happens frequently, you got to figure out what is the optimal GSM that I should fabricate at, which then converts to what is my optimal stitch length per needle that will give me my GSM, which in this colorways means I'll have the minimal chance of rejection. Just a small little tiny example. For that, you need historical data. You need to know, all right, this fabric, this lab dip, what was the end GSM? What approximately does this add? How much does this particular color add to the GSM? Therefore, work backwards from that, give me a GSM target for my machine, work backwards from that, give me an approximate stitch length per feeder. Maybe digressing just a little, but still staying on the topic of data and linking it back to your point of view on AI that you talked about earlier, optimization versus prediction. This idea of workflow disruption, which I believe links very much so to your end state vision. The workflow disruption in my mind is helping people do their jobs with the information they need when they need it, linking cross-functionally more effectively and kind of removing this kind of Excel handover exchange. I have a personal point of view that's part of the end state solution is the workflow automation, and which I call workflow disruption. Yeah.
I've always assumed that relies heavily on historical data because in some cases, we're trying to actually get robots making decisions with robots instead of people making decisions with people. Not in all instances, right? But even if in 10% of instances, just getting rid of those simple decisions and automating those simple decisions. I'm just sharing a point of view, actually, just to see if you counter that point of view, or you kind of, is that where data becomes more essential? Because even in your vision of planning, it's the changing of the workflow that is kind of integral to the
Right.
end state. But I guess what you're saying is it's not integral in a planning capacity to change the workflow, that there might be other areas. I think about country of origin design, for example. I want to move more to Bangladesh and less out of somewhere else. I want to go more near shore.
Yeah.
Heavily relying on historical data and even predictive data
Yeah.
to do that in a workflow redesign, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's two ways to approach that problem,
Yeah.
right? There's a top-down, which requires historical data because you let the model make the assumptions. And there's a bottom-up. The bottom-up approach is you understand something about those countries, you build a set of rules, and then you do inference over it, which is optimization. But actually, the hybrid model is the best. In your particular example, you probably want to have a bit of both, where you have historical data and you also have an inherent understanding of how those work. But when it comes to workflow reprocessing, I think one of my approaches is first, start smaller than you think. So we start very, very, very small. If you're talking about knit planning, just start with knit machine planning for fabric. Don't even go garment yet. Like embarrassingly small. And then and it's actually quite complicated. The second thing is how you do discovery. This is sort of a product management thing, which is there's this thing called the mom test. You know, if you ask your mom, "Oh, mom, do you think this painting's beautiful?" She's going to say, "Yeah, of course it's beautiful," right? But it doesn't pass the test, right? Like obviously she's going to say that. Most people are inclined to just give you what you want to hear. So you have to do discovery in a way that you take that bias out. You really want to get to the root problem. And so that's an art, I would say. There's a little bit of a science to it as well, but getting to understanding what is the actual problem and then using that to define the workflow is essential. And I think too many people come in with a point of view. When I walk into a room, I have no point of view. I'm there to listen to that person. I'm there to understand their point of view and ask questions, but not give them solutions. Because there, I'm just trying to build my understanding of that problem. And so, you know, in any example that I do, that's my strategy. And I think when you do that strategy, you co-create a solution. The biggest issue with any technology is a lack of buy-in. I actually don't even think that technologies are solutions. They're enablement of solutions. They're coupled with processes. And you know how I feel about technology with the wrong process. It's like a jet engine and a horse carriage. You know, the story where people thought, oh, let's just attach a jet engine to a horse carriage. The horse carriage will go faster. No, the horses got scared. The carriage like essentially incinerated from the heat of the jet engine, and then you got net negative results. That's what people are doing today with AI and the fashion industry. The PCG report reported 4% of executives who have deployed AI saw ROI from it. 96% said no, because they're not understanding what the tool is actually about. It's a tool. You need to understand your processes. You need to understand what does this mean. And I gave you that example about what is the role of AI, right? I think the role of AI, and this is my opinion, is that it allows you to make higher dimensional decisions. Then you have to think to yourself, well, where would higher dimensionality decision making benefit me from a business perspective and from a human perspective? And that analysis, that critical thinking is missing. Everyone just goes straight to the easiest answer, which is, oh, I'll use it for forecasting. I'll use it for design generation. Designers don't want the funnest part of their job to be automated. And forecasters are already very skeptical about forecasting models. And we know that you can't predict the future in the way that, with the precision that you need to when you're doing planning. And so those two use cases, I'm very confident no one will succeed at doing it because it's not solving the right problem. The right problem is, how do you build a system in sourcing and supply chain that allows you to be agile and has the hubris and the humility to say, I actually don't know what people want. I have an idea, I have a rough view of it, but I built a system that allows me to have the idea and that rough view, and it adapts to that and it thrives in that environment. And that's the goal, in my opinion, for the industry.
I mean, I love the vision. I love the way you talk about it. We could talk about it endlessly, actually. And I happen to very much agree. There's so much complexity, yet there's so much commercial, and not just commercial, but whether it's social or planet, there's so much unlocked potential when we talk about sourcing in the supply chain. Maybe if I just kind of wrap up with one or two last questions. A totally different question. You do spend a fair bit of your time in academia. I'd really love to just hear what you're seeing from the students. You know, maybe what are they worried about, or what are they driven towards?
Yeah. I should probably mention that my students are computer scientists and not people working in the fashion industry.
Right.
Is the question so relevant?
I think it's a yes.
I think a lot of people are worried about will they have their jobs, and I think that's a universal feeling, right? And I think that applies to software engineers when they see tools that write code on their own, and it applies to people in the fashion industry who are feeling like, well, would I have a designing job, or is there going to be a supply planning job if all these tools exist? So I think there's a philosophical view, and then there's a practical view, and I think they're actually quite in line. Will there be some jobs reduced? Many jobs reduced, for sure. But if you look throughout history, when computers, the word computer doesn't refer to what we think of the computer today, which is like a laptop or whatever. The word computer was primarily referred to humans, mostly women, who would physically calculate things. Like they were just calculators. Mm-hmm. And they would call them computers. They would compute things, right? And then now we have computers. And then obviously all those people lost their jobs. And so at every sort of junction when we've had technology and innovation, we lost a lot of jobs, but then there's a huge bunch of jobs that are created. Can you think of how many jobs that have been created from computers? Software companies, people who fix computers, people who sell computers, so on and so forth, right? Endless. We just haven't gotten to that point yet where we'd say, okay, fine, we have this technology. What kind of jobs will it create? But that begs the question, what happens to the people who lose their jobs? That's a different discussion. Personally, if I was to give a quick answer, it's companies that have benefited from AI should contribute a percentage of their profit to train people who have lost their jobs because of AI. Mm-hmm. I just fundamentally think that. Because nobody wants a world where there's many people who are unemployed. That's not good for anyone. Mm-hmm. So that's like a philosophical view. The other aspect of that is accountability. If computers are making decisions and something happens that's wrong, who's accountable? I think for that reason, there's always going to be a human in the loop. When the order gets sent to the factory, the AI is not just going to automatically book it into the machines. A human has to say, yeah, I'm good with that. I've reviewed it, makes sense, I'm okay. So that's the other thing. There has to be accountability. From a practical perspective, there are strategic decisions that I think will be enabled through this technology. I talked about scenario planning. Scenario planning has to make trade-offs. So you might have 3 different scenarios you want to consider. The model might suggest this is the best scenario, but it just depends on what your objectives are. And we live in a multipolar, multidimensional, multi-objective world where I'm trying to trade off, let's say very simply, price, lead time, holistic cost of ownership, CO2 footprint. I can adjust the weights and let the model decide for me. But realistically, what's going to happen is that humans going to have to sit there and think, all right, what matters to me right now? Because day to day, that might change. Mm-hmm. Month to month, that might change. So I think humans, at least in these functions, will have a much more strategic role than one that completely automates their role.
Hey, I think we could talk endlessly. I would love to do it again, actually, because you sparked a whole different set of topics we could uncover as well. But thanks so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it. It's super fascinating, and I'm sure the audience will appreciate it as well. So thanks very much.
Thanks for having me.
I really enjoyed. Thanks, Ahmed.
No worries.